Okay, so we will continue with the internal controls in an online computer system environment. Okay, so we also have here the general and application control. For the general control, we have the access controls. So procedures designed, so these are the procedures designed to restrict access to the programs and data. Okay, another is controls over the IDs and passwords. So these are the procedures for the assignment and maintenance of passwords. This is for the purpose of restricting the access to authorized users only. Another CIS general control is system development and maintenance controls. So these are the additional procedures to ensure that the controls essential to online applications are included in the system during its development and maintenance. So this is very important. Another is for the programming controls. These are procedures also designed to prevent or detect improper changes to the computer programs, which are accessed through the different online workstations. So this is for the protection of the computer programs being altered. Another is transaction logs. So these reports for each online transaction which are designed to create an audit trail. So meaning there are still internal controls to maintain this audit trail. Okay. Another is use of antivirus software programs. So this is very important for the data. So virus scans can be run on every workstations daily, and they can set also to scan all the files. For the application controls, CIS application controls, we have for the pre-processing authorization. So these are permissions to initiate a transaction. Another is edit, reasonable, and other validation tests. So these are programmed routines that checks the input data and processing results for completeness, accuracy, and reasonableness of the data being processed or placed in the computer. Another is cut-off procedures. So these are procedures which ensures that all the transactions are processed in the proper accounting period. We also have the file controls. So these are procedures which ensure that the correct data files are used for online processing. For the master file controls, so these are controls that intended for any changes to the master files should be controlled by the procedures similar to those used for controlling other input transaction data. Okay, so this is to make sure that this data are complete without alteration and are being processed accordingly. We also have balancing. For balancing, this is the process of establishing control totals over data that is submitted for processing through workstations and comparing the control totals during and after the processing. This is done to make sure that complete and accurate data are transferred to each processing phase. So this is to eliminate errors. Rejecting data. So these are procedures to ensure that rejected items are complete prior to their reprocessing into the system to avoid rejecting it again. Okay, so those are the different internal controls in an online computer system environment. So we will continue with computer information system environment. Okay, so here normally the entity will use a database. Okay, so a database, this is a collection of by the way, this is a database management or DBMS, sorry. So database management, okay, system, sorry. Okay, so this is the last part of our module. Okay, so a database, this is a collection of data that is stored in an efficient and compact manner. So that is shared and used by a number of different users for different purposes. So database management system or DBMS, this is a collection of the programs which are used to define, create, and maintain the database. Meaning, database is a location where all the data is stored, okay, for the entity, which can be easily accessed by the different users. Basically, DBMS is a general purpose software. So this is a package which has an overall purpose is to create and maintain the information and to make that available if that is demanded. Okay, so the DBMS software has the following functions. First, it defines the structure of the database. It also involves defining tables, fields, and their data types, constraints for data to be stored in the database, as well as the relationship among the different tables. Another is populating the data, meaning it involves storing the data into database. So it has a storage maximum memory. Okay. Another is manipulating the database. So it involves retrieving, updating, or deleting, even inserting new data and generating reports from the database. For example, when one draws an amount from a bank using the ATM card, so the person having such transaction is actually accessing the database of the bank, but only on his personal account. So the account is accessed and checked through the ATM. When the amount is drawn, then the record in the database will automatically be updated. Okay, what are the advantages of using DBMS? So this is reduction. There is reduction of data redundancy because, for example, in a traditional computer file processing, each application program has its own files. So therefore, several copies of the same data are created in many places, whereas in DBMS, all the data of the organization is only integrated in a single database. The data is recorded at only one place in the database and is not duplicated. That's how DBMS is used. Okay. For example, the dean's faculty file and the payroll file contain several identical items. So the list of names of faculty and so on. So when these are converted into database, the data is integrated into a single database. So the multiple copies of the same data are reduced to a single copy only. So this are reducing the data redundancy. So storage space can be saved. So that's how useful DBMS is. Another advantages is there is data consistency. So by controlling the data redundancy, there is consistency. Okay. If the data item appears only once, any update to its value has to be performed only once as well. Okay, for the users. Another is data sharing. Individual pieces of the data in the database can be shared for the different authorized users. So each of these users will have the access to the same piece of data. Okay, at the same time, and different users can also use it for different purposes. Data independence. So there is a separation of data, structure of database from the application program that is used to access the data from the database. In DBMS, the database application programs are separated, okay, from each other. So that's why the structure of the database can be easily changed without modifying the application program. There is also data security because only authorized persons are allowed to access the database. So some of the users may be allowed to access but only a part, okay, of the database, or only the data that is related to them or to their department, such as our example in the ATM. So only your account can be accessed. So data or database access language. This is used to communicate or to access the data to and from the database. In this case, the users use the database access language to enter the new data. So it's like an access code. They can enter new data, change the existing data, retrieve data from the database. Most of the DBMS, usually they use SQL or structured query language. So this is the standard database access language used to access the data from multiple tables in the database. Another advantage is there is backup and recovery procedures. So most DBMS provide the backup and recovery subsystems. This automatically creates the backup and restore data if required. For example, if the computer system fails in the middle of an update operation of the program, so the recovery subsystem will make sure that the database is restored to the state it was in before the program started executing. Okay, so that's how useful is the backup and recovery procedure. So what are the functions of a database administrator and who is this database administrator? So this is a person who is responsible for managing the overall database management system. So he is called the database administrator or DBA. So he has the following responsibilities. First, he has to define the database structure, install and manage the DBMS, create databases, related objects like tables and indices, authorize access to the database, coordinate and monitor the DBMS, acquire software hardware as resources needed, security and integrity control, maintain the operational system, create backup and of the data regularly. He also provides administrative support. Okay, so those are the different functions of a database administrator. So the entity should also create a position for this, especially for DBMS. So for the granting privileges, okay, so we have here the limits, okay, for the number of users in a DBMS. So we have horizontal propagation and vertical propagation control. So for horizontal propagation control, this limits the number of users to whom a user can assign privilege or access to the database. Whereas the vertical propagation control, so this limits the depth of propagation of, or numbers of users in a sequence that can be granted privileges. Okay, but of course, again, these are just related to the access over the DBMS, the data there. So we have the different types of access control policy. So these are the internal controls that should be applied in the DBMS. Okay, so we have the discretionary access control policy. So in the discretionary access, it allows users to specify who can access the data they own and what action privilege they have with respect to that data. For the discretionary access control policies, we have the following. Okay, name-dependent restrictions. Users either have the access to a named data resource or they do not have the access to the resource. Okay. Another is content-dependent, meaning users are permitted only or denied access to a data resource depending on the contents. We also have the context-dependent restriction. So users are permitted or denied access to data resource depending on the context in which they are seeking the access. And history-dependent restriction. In this case, users are permitted or denied access to the data resource depending on the time series of access to and actions they have undertaken on the data. So all of this will have the restrictions or limit on the users on how they access and use the information in the database. And the second type of access control is mandatory access control policy. So in this case, it requires a database administrator to sign security attributes to data that cannot be changed by the database user. So here, the database administrator is the one who will give the access. Okay, so those are the different types of control policies in the DBMS.